Hey, I'm going to start chapter 4 by freaking you out just a little tiny bit. You know that what we see is super limited? Like, we really don't have very good eyesight when it comes to the visible spectrum of light. If we had the ability to see more of the visible spectrum of light, the world would look completely different to us. Completely different. But because of our narrow abilities as far as taking in information visually, we see one world where an alien might see a completely different world. Just think about that for a second. It really comes down to what kinds of information our brains can take in, and then how our brain makes meaning out of it. And that's what chapter 4 is all about. It's about sensation and perception. What we are able to take in from the outside world, and then our brains making meaning out of that information. So again, not to really freak you out, but just to kind of frame what this chapter is all about. So sensation is neurons in a receptor taking in that outside information and making nerve impulses out of that information. And we're going to talk about the different senses that we have as far as taste and touch and smell, etc., and how our bodies do this. Perception then is going to be making those nerve patterns meaningful. That's really our brain's job. Our brain likes to make meaning out of things. We've talked about that with memories. Sometimes memories are false because something that we see is so off the wall, so unusual, so novel to us that our brains will actually change the memory a little bit in order to make it mean something to us, help us to understand it. So sensation is taking in information, creating nerve impulses, and then perception is making those meaningful. Great example on the next slide. I'm going to be quiet for about 20 seconds. Read this next slide. Okay, that's what we mean when we talk about perception. We're taking in visual stimuli here, but other things are going on in our brains in order for us to read this. So let's take a second and talk about two different ways that our brains do this. The first is called bottom-up processing. Think about this in terms of learning a different language or learning how to read a different language. For most of us, learning how to read like Spanish or French, one of those languages that use the Roman alphabet that we're used to, wouldn't be too difficult. It would take time, obviously, but we could sound out words and we could make meaning out of those words. Now, consider trying to learn how to read Chinese or Arabic or Greek, languages that use different letters, different alphabet. Now we'd have to pay attention to the details of each letter and each word in order to make meaning out of it. So that's called bottom-up processing, where we're going to look at individual details, and then that goes up to our brains. This is how I remember it. It starts at the bottom and then goes up to our brains. Our brains have pre-existing knowledge and understanding and experience, and then the brain then makes meaning out of that. That's as opposed to top down, when things start at the top and then filter down to the details. So top down processing is going to, let me move this up a little bit. This is going to emphasize what we expect to see. Even if the details don't match up with what we're used to, we can still make meaning out of it because our brains are saying, oh, from experience, I recognize those certain letters and I can make meaning out of it. Again, let me go back to this particular slide here. We can make meaning out of this because of top-down processing. Our brains have a familiarity with the language, with the alphabet, with the letters that we're seeing, and we're able to understand what this paragraph is. Now, consider if we tried to look at this paragraph through bottom-up processing, and we looked at each little detail, it would make absolutely no sense. So bottom-up processing versus top-down processing. Okay. All right, selective attention, an actual psychology term, the cocktail party effect. And you've all had this experience out in the middle of the hallways during a passing period. there's hundreds of people passing by you. There are people talking constantly. You've got teachers saying hi and all of this stuff. And you're able to have a conversation with one other person because of the cocktail party effect. That's when you can give your attention to one stimulus, one person. You're just dialed into one particular, maybe you're looking at your phone and everything else around you is going on and you can hear it, but you're not paying attention to it. So you can give all your attention to the phone or the person that you're chatting with. Okay. Now, this gives me a good moment to talk about that famous term that we like to talk about with multitasking. Yes, people can multitask. You can do several things at once, but it's impossible to do any of those at your full capability. Multitasking is an impossibility. You can see on the comic strip there. We talk about it, we laugh about it, but you really and truly can't multitask if you expect to be doing more than one thing at your full potential. Because our attention is divided, we can't do one particular thing when we're trying to do something else at the exact same time, again, at its full potential. So you've all had this experience too, where you're talking to somebody and they get a text message. And so now all of a sudden their attention is divided, and you know what that feels like. It kind of feels icky. And we've probably done it to somebody else as well, where we're kind of paying attention to the text on the phone and not really paying attention to what they're saying. Many of you might be doing that right now while you're watching this video. You might be looking over at an email or something else and not having full attention on the video in front of you. That is the opposite of selective attention, and that, of course, is detrimental to our learning and our understanding, our being present to other people. All right, it'll be up to Mr. Woodard and I to talk about or show some videos here, but I'm just going to give you a couple of quick terms. Inattentional blindness is when we don't see something that is literally in front of our faces. Again, the video will make this very clear to you, okay? But that happens quite a bit. If our attention is so focused on one thing, we'll miss something that's right in front of our eyes, literally right in front of our eyes. And magic loves this term here, change blindness. Because we're focusing on one thing, we might miss something that changes, again, right in front of our eyes, simply because our attention is so focused on one particular thing, one particular aspect, one particular person. Okay? All right. When we talk about sensation or stimulation becoming sensation, the brain senses the world indirectly. That's what I was talking about at the beginning of the video here. We don't see everything that's out there because the sense organs are actually converting certain stimuli into neural impulses, which then the brain has to interpret. So there's several steps that are going on from that stimulation that's out there actually making sense in our own brains. Again, we're going to talk about each of the five senses and how this biologically works within the body. The key terms for this process is going to be receptors and transduction. Receptors are neurons that take in stimulation and they're activated. So certain light comes into our eyes. Neurons then pick up that light and they start to transduce that information into nerve impulses. Those nerve impulses then can be made meaningful by the brain. Okay? So again, I'm going to leave it off there. Mr. Woodard's going to start talking about thresholds, but for this first introductory video, just really start keeping in mind our brains are making meaning out of the world around us and what information is coming in, even if that information isn't as full as what's actually out there, because our brains couldn't handle that much because there's so much with different visible spectrums and different sounds coming in. There's so much stimuli out there, our brains have to narrow it down. Okay? I'll leave it off there and let Mr. Woodard talk about thresholds.